Thank you so much for joining us today. This is an extremely important topic, and the only way that we are going to fight for abortion access and advocate for abortion expansion throughout our state and our country is if we are knowledgeable. So I'm so proud to see all of us here today, learning everything that we can learn so that we can face this fight together. We have tremendous speakers who know everything there is to know about the current and developing abortion landscape, who are going to teach us today. But I would like first for everyone to just please introduce themselves in the chat. Just let us know what county you're joining us from, and if you are actively running, what office you're running for, and if you're thinking about running, what office you're thinking about running for. And I'm going to just say in introduction that, as we all know, the crisis that came out of the Supreme Court last month was a leaked draft opinion that would overturn Roe v. Wade entirely, allowing states to determine whether abortion would be accessible or completely inaccessible and criminal. This is obviously a disaster for women and all people across our nation, and we need to fight as hard as we possibly can against it. This is one of the most important issues for this election cycle, which is why we wanted to run this training, because this is a candidate issue, absolutely. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Kristen Dart, who is the Vice President of Political Affairs at Planned Parenthood Empire State Acts. And she is going to talk to us about the way Planned Parenthood is responding, the importance of this issue, and the effect on clinical workers. Kristen.
Thank you, Sophie, for the introduction, and thank you, everybody, for joining. It's so great to be here, and I'm happy to be on an Eleanor's Legacy training. One of my first trainings that I went to when I was entering political life was Emily's List co-sponsored training on fundraising. So that was one of my first forays into politics, and it has led me to the professional life of advocacy, and I'm really grateful for the work that you all do. As Sophie said, I am Kristen Dart. I'm the Vice President of Political Affairs for Planned Parenthood Empire State Acts, which is the advocacy organization that supports the work of all 5 Planned Parenthood affiliates across the state. And I'm located in lovely upstate New York. And because it is miserable in the winter, I'm doing this from my backyard because I love summer and I will take all of it that I can get. So I'm happy to share. It is a dismal space out there, as Sophie mentioned. We were talking before you all joined about the anxiety that is happening for all of us as we await the Supreme Court decision. We know when the decision days are, but we don't know what those decisions will be. So we're not sure when the Jackson Women's Health v. Dobbs case will have a decision in it. We did see the leaked opinion that was absolutely egregious. When an opinion is quoting 12th century English law, we have a problem. And so the impacts will be felt deeply across the country. We know that 26 states will go offline, 13 of them immediately, and then another 13 will anticipate them enacting laws that would ban abortion access in their states. So that leaves half the states without abortion access, but a much larger proportion of the population without abortion access. So we, and I'm going to place in the chat a link to the Guttmacher map that has the list of all of the states. As you can imagine, we will lose access in the South and in the majority of the Midwest. So we basically come into a place where it is the West Coast, the East Coast, Illinois, where we will have sustained access, Colorado in the middle of the country. Nebraska stays on that map, but we anticipate them falling pretty quickly. The other piece that people don't always talk about is Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is currently silent on abortion laws and is definitely at the will of the legislature and the governor. It is a Republican legislature now and a Democratic governor. Those elections are happening in this cycle, and it really could hang in the balance of Pennsylvania. So that has a deep impact on care across the country, and particularly in states that stay access states. We are already seeing patients from other states and have been for a long period of time, not just because of states ending abortion access, but the restrictions that other states have, whether that be waiting periods, biased counseling, and having it be hard for minors to access abortion care. We see a surprising number of patients from Massachusetts, because the western part of Massachusetts does not have a lot of access. So that has a broad effect. People are traveling for care, which is expensive. The majority of people who are getting abortion care are already parents, so it can mean childcare, leaving work commitments. It also means that access for a place like in New York is delayed for New Yorkers who are seeking care. There's only so many clinicians or only so many appointments. And so when you see an influx of patients from Ohio or Pennsylvania or somebody who's traveling from Texas or Missouri, that is an appointment that is taken away, and not taken away, but is taken by somebody from outside of our state. So that means that care is delayed for everybody. And then as you move into places where maybe abortion care stays online, but there's gestational limits, again, that just trickles down into how we access care. The other piece that Planned Parenthood, and I think all abortion clinics are really aware of, is the shift in protester activity. So we have talked a lot about how we make sure that patients access care, which is absolutely critical. But as places end abortion access, a lot of those protesters spend the majority of their time protesting. So we are anticipating seeing a shift in that protest activity to the clinics of access states. Luckily, in the governor's announcement of $35 million for care, 25 of that was to help clinic capacity and infrastructure, and then $10 million of that was for security funds. So we are working to be able to access that money and build security plans for both providers, staff, and patients. And I just think it's critical to raise that because those are all connected together. When you're going to the dentist, you're not walking through protesters, but that is regularly happening in our healthcare facilities. And we want to make sure that patients who are already doing the burdensome travel or just getting to a clinic can be hard sometimes for certain people. We want to try to make them feel as safe as possible. We want our providers to feel as safe as possible. And we will continue, again, that money was invested to build infrastructure. And so hopefully that will help in the hiring of providers so that we make sure that we can add appointments to the calendar. The other trickle down effect is that if people are traveling to New York for birth control or for abortion care, that means that there are less birth control and regular well visits available because, again, there are only so many providers and clinicians. So that's also just another effect on clinics who are providing abortion care of that's already taking up a large portion of our appointments now. How does that expand as we potentially see anywhere from an influx of 50 to 100,000 patients a year trying to seek care? There's been lots of numbers. I think sometimes folks ask, how many people will we see? We don't know. We don't know if people from Texas are going to make New York the first stop. We don't know how many people will get pushed up from, New Jersey because they couldn't get an appointment, et cetera, et cetera. But we do know that the demand will increase. There's no other way around it. What we've been saying for a long time, the need for abortion care doesn't go away just because states decide to make it illegal. So I think I will pause there I know that we're going to do Q&A at the end, and I'll be happy to answer any questions folks have. And again, thank you all for being here and being a critical part of the next steps in this fight.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Planned Parenthood is such an important piece of this puzzle and this fight, and we are so grateful that you took the time to speak to us today. So thank you, thank you. Our next speaker is an expert on all things policy and law. I will tell you that before I was the executive director of Eleanor's Legacy, I used to work for a woman by the name of New York State Attorney General Tish James. And she, on her campaign, when I worked with her, was always going out of her way to talk about abortion access, even when it wasn't the question. She was always ready to champion for abortion. So I know that we are in tremendous hands with her leadership as the top lawyer of our state. And we are so thrilled to be joined today by Darsana Srinivasan, who is the Healthcare Bureau Chief of the Office of the Attorney General. And she is going to talk to us all about the different legislative and legal pieces that need to come together to make sure that New York is an abortion sanctuary, because that takes many pieces, many forms. So I will turn it over to you, Darsana.
Thank you, Sophie, for that lovely introduction. I, too, am a big fan of my boss, Tish James. I've worked previously at the Attorney General under two other AGs, and I have to say this is my favorite one yet. So my background is I previously had been at the Attorney General's office in the Civil Rights Bureau. And before that, I had been at the National Women's Law Center working exclusively on health and reproductive justice issues. So while I now am the chief of the Healthcare Bureau and deal with many other matters, this is an issue that's very near and dear to my heart. And looking at the chat, it's really lovely to see all of you here gather today, committed to this issue, and to see where you're from. And again, the fact that you are determined to work on this issue and that we don't remain the silent majority talking about reproductive justice and reproductive rights and abortion. My boss that is really, what we're here to maintain access to. So I have a PowerPoint. I'm going to share screen. See if I can do that correctly. I'm going to go there and let's see if I can set up the slideshow. Did it happen? Okay, now I hit share. And then I hit this button. All right, is everyone seeing the PowerPoint?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay. So again, I'm very happy to be here to chat with you all about this. I just want to plug my healthcare bureau. So we have an office in New York City and an office in Albany. We also have a specifically dedicated healthcare helpline. You may have heard of our consumer fraud helpline and some others, but this one is dedicated to people who are having issues with their health insurance. And this can include not just, coverage for medications, but also things like gender affirming care and making sure, you're not paying more than the ACA says for your birth control, which is nothing. So just a reminder that resource exists. We have brochures and, to let any of the people you work with know that there's help dealing with health insurers and health insurance plans out there. So turning to the subject today, start. So background, Kristen gave us a great intro. We know why you're here, but even before the leaked Dobbs opinion, we had the Texas SB 8 bill, and our office started becoming concerned with these other states' anti-choice laws that might have extraterritorial effects. We have no idea what could happen to New York providers or New York residents who assisted people in, say, like a state like Texas with obtaining an abortion. Would they be subject to that bounty hunting provision? And so we started considering, what would happen if there was a potential for civil lawsuits and criminal prosecutions of, again, New York residents for receiving or providing or assisting with any kind of abortion service. Again, those that might be legally provided in New York State, those provided through telehealth legally. And we just wanted to start looking at the issue. Then, of course, there was a Dobbs opinion, which sort of really changed the legal landscape and really kicked things into overdrive. And we had a variety of concerns to consider. Our policy folks started assessing the variety of bills that were out there. As Kristen mentioned, there's a variety of opinions on how much increased demand we can expect to see in New York. And even in New York, as again, Kristen and other folks on this call can say, we don't have overwhelming access, clinic access or providers. It's not like we're doing great in providing access all through our North counties and everything else. So, even though Guttmacher estimates that there's going to be an increase of 11 to 13%, we really don't know how far people might travel to get safe access to abortion. And then in addition, again, as was mentioned, once those other states drop those protesters who are standing in front of the clinic day in and day out, who do this full time, only have a handful of states. They have the other, 20 something states left. And of course, the big ones like Illinois, California, and to focus all their attention on in terms of protesting and other activity. And so there's deep concerns about the safety for providers and patients at these clinics and healthcare facilities. There's also, the perennial concern, which is crisis pregnancy centers, which always set up shop just down the street from real providers who go about, waylaying, berating, and otherwise just delaying people who are seeking, time-intensive care. And you can imagine if you're traveling from out of state, that's even worse to, having driven across state borders, taken off the time, figured out your childcare, as Kristen mentioned, to then end up at a CPC that doesn't actually have any healthcare providers, and certainly isn't going to correctly inform you of your referral to, the correct clinic provider. And then obviously money is a big concern, again, for patients who are traveling to New York, providing them with just the practical logistical funds to make that trip is something else for us to think about. And we are thinking about. So this is a brief overview of legislative activity. I think it kind of fell into a variety of buckets. The biggest bucket, and of which there was a lot of time and legislation, were procedural protections. And, these varied. Some were directed just towards providers and those who worked, clinics. Some also covered the patients and those receiving care. Some, those who were just aiding or assisting in the provision of an abortion. Again, considering what would happen if there were these extraterritorial effects of these other states' anti-choice laws. Just to point out that our state legislative session closed on Friday. So I think June 3rd was last day. June 2nd was technically the last day. I think the assembly stayed open for another day just to see if anything else could get passed. So I'm including the variety of bills that came up this session. Some of them were introduced in prior sessions. And then I'll mention which ones specifically. As far as I'm aware, none of the bills I will mention that were passed by both houses have been signed by the governor yet. It hasn't been that long, obviously, but so again, it's unclear which of these will actually become law, but I'll just give you the lay of the land. So outside of procedural protections, I'd say another bucket is sort of just, increasing access to abortion in New York. Again, that includes funding and other monetary sort of provisions, and then telehealth as well. And then there's additional issues of, things we need. We have a pretty great baseline, I think, with the Reproductive Health Act that was passed in 2019. But there is just some other concerns regarding pregnancy outcomes, minors access, and other things that I think are still possibly gray areas that might open us up to legal challenge down the road. So we just want to make sure that we're very well protected as a state, even though we're in pretty good shape compared to some other places. So again, these are some of the legislative protections as they relate to civil suits and criminal prosecution. We talked about procedural protection. So they prohibit our law enforcement with, again, out-of-state investigations as they pertain to, again, these anti-choice extraterritorial. This would someone who's bringing a medical malpractice action, that lawful action that would have existed without one of these anti-choice bills would still get to proceed. Someone was, hurt in a tort or something like that, that would still proceed. But these would be, the investigations for anything lawfully performed in New York. It would prevent the issuance of subpoenas, hopefully prevent extradition, hopefully prevent arrest and other information sharing with our, New York State law enforcement, with these out-of-state law enforcement entities. I think it's not clear how successful they can be. There's, again, a lot of, we really, hope that they'll be successful. The issue is we don't want to give providers or those who assist in this work a false sense of protection. They still might be brought up on criminal charges. They still might be sued in court. And so we're not sure what may happen. So licensure protections, this one's definitely for those providers, making sure that when they, again, legally and lawfully provide abortion here in New York, it can't constitute professional misconduct that could result, in them having their licenses revoked before the board or any other sort of basis for discipline. Similarly, that action can't have any issues with their medical malpractice insurance. So this is to, make sure that their insurance can't drop them or, increase their rates or otherwise take any action for them for providing those legal healthcare services. And then the brand new bucket, which is, the sort of sexiest new thing that the legislature has done, is create this new cause of action, which would allow New York providers or patients to try to recover monies that they might have lost, in an SB8 type situation where they've been slapped with a bounty for having assisted someone in receiving an abortion, and so that they can try to claw back that money judgment here in New York through an action. And they can, there's a variety of those bills floating around as well. I'll note, I think the only state that has passed something in response to these new anti-choice extraterritorial other state laws has been Connecticut. Could be wrong. I think maybe there's one more state out there, but they passed some of these procedural protections. They have not passed the licensure or medical malpractice portion. So these were the bills that did pass so far. Again, none of these have been signed yet by the governor. So if you want to look these up later, so the first is sort of an omnibus. It combines a variety of the other smaller bills. It covers extradition, it covers arrest, it covers the issuance of a subpoena, and again, that law enforcement cooperation and information sharing. So again, those who provide or aid in provision of a legal. And then the other one that was passed was S9384. So this one is there's an address confidentiality program that exists already within the New York Department of State. It's used for survivors of domestic violence and I think maybe some other situations. And now this program would be open to providers, patients, volunteers, immediate family, anyone who feels, threatened. And we talk a lot about, how, again, law enforcement in these states might use data and other, data mining to track people down based on what they're doing. So I can imagine people would want to protect themselves in this way. There were a variety of other protection bills. Again, many are sort of various versions of some of those protections, extradition and anti-cooperation sort of bills. The ones that didn't pass were, this one is exempts a person from out-of-state money judgment, protects their personal property, income, and real property. That did not pass, nor did anything like that, I believe, pass. In addition, that did pass were licensure protections. So this one, again, as we mentioned, protects providers. So this is great. Hopefully, we'll see if this gets passed. As I mentioned, even the Connecticut bill didn't offer this protection. The same is true for medical malpractice. So this, the other bills sort of, I think, again, someone can correct me later, refer to sort of abortion legally offered in New York. This one separately specifies legally prescribed medication abortion through telehealth, which will be interesting to see how that's applied, because in most states to legally prescribe medication abortion, the physician in the other state has to be legally licensed in the state of the patient, as well as the fact that abortion has to be legal in that state. So it's unclear if that's what they mean by legally prescribed or, they mean another scenario. So This was new causes of action that we mentioned. This was the Fire Hate Act. You may have seen the articles about this in New York Mag and elsewhere. So this is the sort of novel procedure to create a private right of action, where, again, if you've been brought up on criminal charges in another state or actually subject to active litigation in another state with this anti-choice law because you've exercised your right to have an abortion in New York State, you have the right to sue. You can pursue punitive damages and try to claw back some of your funds. In addition, what I like about this bill, I'll note, is it's not restricted to abortion or reproductive health. It includes gender affirming care. It includes language concerning something about the endocrine system, I think. But this is a little bit more extensive. As you know, there will be other attempts to restrict healthcare in various ways. So this kind of anticipates what's coming. So this was not passed, but it's another novel bill that would create a private cause of action for an individual to try to claw back money damages. There's been a money judgment against them, such as, the SB8 in Texas, again, for having, legally received or provided reproductive health services in New York. So one of the remaining buckets, which we'd hope to have sort of fixed in this legislative session, which didn't happen, were prosecutions based on pregnancy status, which does happen in New York, where, again, people don't think of it as being because of pregnancy, but it's based on pregnancy status or based on sort of perinatal actions that might have an effect on birth or, a live born baby. Here in New York, we do not have a fetal personhood amendment. We don't have a fetal homicide law, but it still does happen that these cases are brought up. Women are subject to everything from, non-consensual drug testing to, again, having their probation revoked for the same substance use disorders that other people do not have their probation, revoked just because of their pregnancy. So was a separate bill, 9453, which added pregnancy outcomes to the list of 96. That did not pass. The 296 already includes pregnancy, but pregnancy outcomes would be a different category and protect those situations we talked about. In addition, the equality amendment also did not pass this legislative session, which was deeply disappointing, I know, for many of the folks on this call. It would have also included pregnancy and pregnancy outcomes in the new Equal Protection Clause that would have gone into the Constitution of New York State and would also offer these additional protections to pregnant people. So moving on to increasing access and how that could happen. So we talk about how important funding is. So there's abortion funding for paying for medical procedures and practical access, as we talked about, travel, childcare, paying. Again, we've talked about maybe we haven't talked about it, but reimbursement rates are incredibly low, as you might imagine, for the provision of medication abortion, surgical abortion. And so having people help play clinics for that service would be great. Having people be able to pay for their own logistics to get to those clinics would be great. In addition, we have to increase the capacity of providers. We can't just think about this current generation. We have to think about training medical staff and training doctors. I work with a lot of health equity groups. And it's a little disappointing that, they don't get that training in medical school or in nursing school to really think about reproductive justice. They're having conversations, luckily, about starting to have these conversations about health equity and as it relates to, race and gender, but it's still a nascent stage. And so getting to that point where we can start providing that training at an educational level to our healthcare providers would be great. But then also just, increasing their actual capacity by having staff and facilities and programs is also just what we need to start thinking about for the next generation. Furthermore, as law enforcement from the Attorney General's office, we talked about crisis pregnancy centers. There's monitoring, notice, disclosure. There's other things we can do to try to prevent them from engaging in this misleading work and, delaying people who are seeking their reproductive care. At our office, there's also the Civil Rights Bureau and the Consumer Frauds Bureau that does a lot of this work in sort of helping and make sure that consumers are not misdirected or, led astray by ads or other things. And so we're looking into what we can add in that space as the AG's office. And then lastly, telehealth services for medication abortion. I think this is, again, a very long game of thinking about all the steps that need to take place for how we can expand telehealth access. And again, this isn't just about abortion and reproductive justice. So that's what we're here to talk about. Expanding telehealth access helps many people. It helps the disabled community in increasing access. It can help the trans community in gaining access to gender affirming care. It's really useful along a lot of metrics. And so telehealth services is not just ensuring the legality of services that are provided across state lines, where our providers in one state and the patients are in another, but also making sure that health insurance companies reimburse at rates that have parity with in-office rates to ensure that they actually offer those services through telehealth. So again, that's a sort of slow by accretion process towards hopefully increasing access to medication abortion across the state. So funding abortion access, again, as Kristen mentioned, the governor has allocated $25 million to an abortion provider support fund. About $10 million went to security grants, which is very needed. There were a few other bills this session that would have further increased funding. The Reproductive Freedom and Equity Program, again, would have increased capacity and training. It would have funded uncompensated care. It would have provided practical support, again, for those individuals attempting to access care for their own personal logistics. This one I was surprised did not pass, which is the Abortion Access Fund, 758. It doesn't cost the state any money. It would have been, again, for individuals designating a gift on their own personal tax return incomes to go to a fund, like a state fund for an abortion access fund. If you've ever donated locally to, an abortion fund that pays for poor women to get abortions, that's effectively what this would have been. So again, I'm a little surprised it didn't pass, unless I'm wrong about that. So please correct me. And then again, there was another separate act to just set aside an additional $15 million for indigent women who have to travel to New York, and again, covering their costs and fees to ensure that they can get reproductive access if they make it to New York, and to ensure that they can make it to New York. So back to crisis pregnancy centers, which, again, Kristen, I'm sure the other folks can tell you, very much do exist, are very much a thorn in the side of both patients and providers and the rest of us who really just, want people to get the care that they want. This is healthcare. And so they don't provide abortion services. They don't provide any healthcare. I work in this space, and sometimes I visit a website and I spend, 5 or 6 minutes going, wait, what is this? Clicking through their beautifully designed website because they're so well funded, where they, seem very neutral on their face. They list out all of the services from, STI testing to abortion. And they use pretty neutral language, many of them. There's no, hellfire or brimstone or shaming or anything hateful in any of these websites. And, they've got pictures of people in white lab coats, or, it just does not track that this would not be a healthcare provider, and certainly not a healthcare provider that wouldn't tell you about abortion when you just view their websites. And so you can imagine that, folks who are Googling a region or trying to find an abortion provider, might get confused and end up at these places that don't offer any such service. So there's this one passed. So this was 470. So it authorizes the Department of Health to conduct a study and issue a report regarding the impact of what you've also heard another term for crisis pregnancy centers as limited service pregnancy centers, because when you go to these places, you might, they'll hand out formula and diapers and other things people might need. But obviously, the reason people are going there is because they need formula and diapers, not because they don't, necessarily need reproductive health care. And so this report will hopefully shine a light on CPCs in a way. Again, the Department of Health has to carry out the study. that has not been done before. And hopefully if we can see, what kind of waste and also, again, what kind of needs are not being met, we can offer those instead of, again, a CPC, which can falsely claim to be offering a community service when they're not.
Excuse me, can I just ask, did that bill require that study or just allow the Commissioner of Health to do it?
It's a good phrasing. It authorizes it. I mean, I can
Which is a requirement.
It's a requirement. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Danielle.
It has a deadline.
It does have a deadline tied to it? Okay, great.
18 months.
Oh, wow. Okay. So it does have to happen. Thank you, Danielle. So telehealth, medication abortion, I think this for many of us is sort of the hope is that, this is how we get around clinics and providers and surgical abortion in all its forms being restricted, is medication abortion. It's safe. The FDA has dropped a lot of its restrictions and its REMS. They could do more. The feds could do more there. But, the first step, again, for the legal provision of medication abortion, that's sort of the gray area where someone drives across state or, does something else or goes to a PO box or whatever the situation might be to really provide legal medication abortion. One of the first steps we saw was the telehealth compact bill. I think this passed, but then I'm not so sure, actually. It was supposed to be in the budget bill, but I don't think it went through either. It was to have New York join an existing interstate medical licensure compact that a variety of other states belong to. It just, allows New York physicians to legally practice, telehealth medicine in those other states who are also members of the compact. And so it gives physicians, a streamlined way to go about doing this rather than maybe the more onerous process of being separately licensed in each of these compact member states. And we thought that was a great first step for improving access for a variety of reasons, again, not just related to abortion access. And that, I believe, did not pass. So I guess I'm maybe I moved through this pretty fast, but we can wait for the end for questions, but I can also go back. Or we can move on.
Thank you so much, Darsana. I think we're going to have Danielle and then we'll take questions for you as well, if that's okay. Perfect. Let me just... Hello.
There we go. Hi, everybody. So I'm Danielle.
Let me introduce you first. You deserve a...
I was going to do it myself. Go for it.
You deserve a flowery introduction. First, I want to acknowledge we have Senator Roxanne Prasad joining us today. So thank you so much, Senator, for joining us. And for our third speaker of the evening, we have the true queen of abortion advocacy. I can't imagine anyone who knows more and feels more passionately about advocating for abortion in the state of New York and beyond. So I'm thrilled to introduce my friend and the Vice President of Political and Government Affairs at the National Institute of Reproductive Health, Danielle Castaldi-Mica.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you so much, Sophie. That was a better introduction than I would have given myself.
You deserve it.
So, for folks who may or may not be familiar with the National Institute for Reproductive Health, we are a national nonprofit based here in New York City. I am currently based in my apartment, that focuses specifically on expanding reproductive health rights and justice at the state and local level. I come to this work after having spent a very long time working at the New York City Council, and I am very much an acolyte of the importance of local government. I also worked in the state Senate for a while, so this is all real in my wheelhouse. So I want to start, first of all, by thanking the other presenters who have done a really good job of laying out a lot of information and a lot of details. I'm going to pull us back just a little bit to talk a little bit about what we can collectively envision for the state of New York. We have what feels like a tidal wave of terrible news coming at us. We know this decision is coming out. We've been given a preview of how truly terrible it could be. And realistically, even if it's not as terrible as the decision that comes out, that was leaked is, the impact will be the same. So I'm hoping that folks, I'm gonna make you engage a little bit. That folks will put in the chat a couple of words, a phrase of when I say, what do you envision for reproductive freedom in New York? What do you think that means here in New York? What is the vision that you have for a state that supports and promotes reproductive freedom? Refuge, overwhelmed, a safe haven that could become overwhelmed quickly, options for all, legal, affordable, accessible, culturally appropriate healthcare, sanctuary, free abortion for all, I love it, affordable birth control, access to a doctor who gives me an appointment, abortion pills by mail, overturning Hyde. Yes, we'll talk a little bit about the Hyde Amendment, Sophie. Free access to abortion, personal care, etc. A state that supports reproductive freedom, offers all birth control and abortion services for its residents with no hassles. Beautiful. State that might become more polarizing as protesters focus on New York State. A very real fear. It's even supportive medical care for abortion. So folks can continue to put that in there. But I think that there are some very comprehensive sex ed in New York. Thank you, Rochelle. I think that there are some pretty clear themes that are coming out here, which is accessibility and personal freedom and liberty. Really, being left alone by other people who want to know my personal business is a pretty good summary, Kate. And so when we look at battery of laws that we attempted to pass this year, things like the Reproductive Health Act that we passed in 2019, things like repealing the Hyde Amendment, which is the federal law that prohibits federal funds from being spent on abortion care. We're really talking about attempts at removing government intervention from accessing healthcare. And I think as people who care about abortion access, which I'm going to just work on the assumption that we all are here, one of the biggest things that we can do, and I am saying this because it is post-legislative session, because last week I would be telling you to make a lot of phone calls. But right now, we're out of legislative session at the state level. It is extremely important that everyone in this room be prioritizing this conversation, and more importantly, be prioritizing actively working to destigmatize abortion in your life. And what I mean by that is this. And if you are like the lefty feminist friend in your family or in your group, they're going to talk about it to you. And I think candidates, for those of us who are running for office or plan to run for office, are talking about it in an exceptionally destigmatized way. We went through what I would consider a real rough patch in the 90s, where there was a real focus on safe, legal, and rare. And I often get legislators asking me when I lobby, what do we need to do to reduce the number of abortions? And my answer is always, I am uninterested in reducing the number of abortions. Frankly, there are less abortions right now than there need to be because people are denied access to that. But the correct answer, in my opinion, to how many abortions should there be is exactly as many as are needed. And not one less. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, I am going to share my screen, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some messaging research that we've done at the National Institute for Reproductive Health that can maybe help folks have those conversations both in their personal life and as candidates or as elected officials, if and when that it comes to that. So first thing that we are going to look at, there we go, is this message triangle, right? What you're thinking about is, what does your audience need to know? What is the vision of the world you're trying to build? What are your values in this world? What is the problem that you're trying to solve? And what solutions are you presenting? All of that comes together to create the core messaging that we're going to talk about. These are messages that we have tested. We've tested them in an electoral capacity specifically. So we've tested them as candidates are using them. One of the places where I think that sometimes abortion rights activists and candidates stumble is waiting for this fight to come to them. We really encourage, especially in New York, candidates, general public, to be raising this before it gets brought to them, right? Before your opponent starts talking about how, you know, you want to expand abortion until the moment of birth, and that's a bad thing. You should be talking about how people should have the most basic rights, freedoms, opportunities to control their lives. We need to be respecting people, supporting them, empowering them. We need people to be able to make the decisions that are best for their lives, and so that they can participate in their communities with dignity and equality, right? That's what we're talking about. What is the impact when people can't have an abortion? Their entire life has changed. Their ability to participate in society has shifted. So when we're talking about abortion, we need to talk about sort of what the impact has been, right? Some of this is like not less relevant, but feels less emergency than it did 6 months ago, because the emergency has changed. But it's worth noting, legality alone has never been enough, right? People prior to SB 8 did not have access to abortion in their states. People post SB 8 in Texas have not had abortion this entire time. So while abortion has technically been legal, folks in states across the country and here in New York have not had access to care. Legality does not equal access. It's an important step, but it does not create access. This is a denial of our freedom, and that has been evidenced by the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of medically unnecessary burdens on accessing abortion care that have happened across the country. Obviously, when the Supreme Court decision comes out, it's going to be worse. Kristen went over some of those numbers. But the thing that is always important to remember is that when abortion care is unavailable, it is the hardest on the people who are already struggling the most, or who already have the most impacted identities, right? I am a middle-class white lady in Brooklyn. If I need an abortion, I will likely be able to find one. That is not the case if I was poor or not white, or maybe living in a rural community, or not English speaking, or uninsured, or had federal insurance, or lived on a reservation, or had a disability that impacted travel, right? So the solution we have found is talking about this in a way that centers values. This is something, I will be honest with you, I have sometimes a hard time with. Because I talk about this all day, every day, and I'm really mad all the time. And that can be challenging, right? But what we have found, that if you're knocking on doors, or you're talking to your neighbor, or you're canvassing, or you're phone banging, or you're talking to a constituent, or you're talking to your weird cousin, starting from a place of, I'm identifying the need to respect decision-making, identifying abortion as healthcare and not a crime, talking about supporting access to the full range of reproductive health care. And again, noting that legality is not enough. It needs to be access, affordability for everybody. Sometimes people do have deep conflicting views. We like phrases like, we can all hold our own moral views about abortion and still trust someone to make this decision for themselves. Especially for legislators, it is not my job to judge. It is not my job to make laws about this. I'm not comfortable deciding for somebody else whether or not they make this decision. And I think in personal life, if someone I care about makes this decision, I want them to have support. I want them to have my support. There is often a lot of discussion about how this is a question of religion versus not religion. That is a very Christian-focused argument. The number of and a narrow subset of Christian argument, right? Lots of faiths support abortion access. Some faiths, in fact, require the support of abortion access. If you talk to most rabbis, they will tell you that if there is a decision that needs to be made between the life or health of the mother and that of the fetus, that the mother wins every single time, and it is in fact a requirement to care for her. So when folks say it's a religious argument, they are talking about a very narrow subset of religious arguments. And I think that there is a lot of universe in which people can talk about the ways in which their faith actually requires them to support abortion access, requires you to support women and families. And it requires compassion and community care rather than judgment. Ooh. Sometimes, and this is very candidate focused, so if you're not a candidate, this may look different around your dining room table, right? But we are going to see a lot of candidates make the crazy later abortion attacks. We saw that when the RIJ was passed, the Reproductive Health Act. Lots of discussion about how this would allow for abortion up to the moment of birth. What a disaster. Most people have no idea what the circumstances around later abortion are in the US. It is a very small number of procedures. It is about to get bigger. It's about to get bigger because it's going to take people longer to access abortion care. In general, this is a good tip for like everything. Don't repeat your opponent's argument or disinformation. And like I mentioned this before, don't let this be the first time you're talking about it. But more importantly, the response to that should always be, this is not a decision that gets made by lawmakers. Every pregnancy is different. Every pregnancy is potentially life-threatening, and someone's health and her circumstances should drive those medical decisions with her provider, right? These are just useful pivot phrases. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. However, I am going to spend a little bit of time on the last two. The anti-abortion movement, similar to the anti-BLM folks, the people who are arguing against critical race theory, the people who are arguing against trans kids, love to talk in hypotheticals. They are making up fantasies to be afraid of. It is always useful to point that out. Frankly, that is a hypothetical. Let me tell you about something that is real. That is an anti-abortion talking point. Let me tell you about the reality. So this is probably the slide that is like the most useful to the most people. There have been in the last 50 years of abortion advocacy, lots and lots of changes in language. Sorry, there's a bug. And lots of ways in which we've shifted our language around abortion. We don't really say pro-choice that frequently anymore. We say support abortion access. We say pro-abortion. We say someone is an abortion supporter, right? One of those reasons is because if the less we say the word abortion, the more stigmatized it becomes. We have to say it in positive contexts. When Sophie and Darsana talk about Attorney General James saying the word abortion, that is exceptionally important. I worked for Chris Quinn for a long time, who was the Speaker of the City Council, and we actively work together to find places for her to talk about abortion because we knew it was important. Abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. Why does it have to be rare? Abortion is safe. Legal abortion. So instead, we like to say things like legal abortion must be available and affordable, right? We can't go back to the pre-Roe days with women dying from back alley abortions. This also goes for coat hanger imagery. We all want to be able to live a safe and healthy life and be free to define our own path. The other piece that's important to note is that illegal abortions aren't going to look like they looked in the 60s. Medication abortion exists. The internet exists. And while that feels like an emotional boogeyman that is helpful to sort of rely on, there are going to be people who choose to self-manage their abortion. In many states, that will be illegal. In New York, it is not, because we repealed that law in 2019. And we want to make sure that we're also not stigmatizing those people. Abortion is difficult or heartbreaking. No one wants to have an abortion. I think this is a very candidate-y answer of abortion is complex and people experience it in different ways. On a personal level, when people say that to me, my response is I absolutely wanted to have both the abortions that I had. They made my life better. They were not difficult or heartbreaking. They were medical care. They were annoying. It was sort of a pain, but they were not difficult or heartbreaking. And that is just not the case for everybody. And then giving sort of excuses or reasons why someone has had an abortion. We really like to focus when someone has decided to have an abortion, this is what we think it should look like, right? No, that's not my information. We'll just take that off the screen. That was my colleagues. I'm going to stop sharing. One thing I will note in that slideshow, that is from message testing. And that message testing was tested around language talking about women solely. We, as a movement, are always trying to move towards more gender neutral language that recognizes that women are not the only ones who need reproductive health care. We often say a pregnant person. Sometimes we list out all the options, women, trans men, non-binary folks, etc. We have found, so that message testing was done with the word woman, so we have to stick with it for the data. But we have found that if you talk about pregnant people or people who can get pregnant, unless someone is actively seeking to have that fight with you, they don't recognize that you're necessarily using gender neutral language. They just hear pregnant people and they about whatever they picture when they picture a pregnant person. So I don't want you to be afraid of using that. So I see that there has been a bunch of stuff happening in the chat. I want to lay out a little bit of a vision of what we're going to do here in New York, but then turn it over for. So, as my fellow presenters laid out, right, we have what I think is a responsibility here in the state of New York. It is to make sure that our laws protect people seeking abortion access, whether they live here or not, that our providers are able to provide that care safely to people, whether they live here or not, that people are receiving accurate information and not being misled, and that people can afford that care. The last piece is enshrining all of these things into laws in ways that cannot be easily overturned. Sometimes people forget that New York is not just New York City. Sometimes people forget that Rudy Giuliani was the mayor of New York City. We have a legacy of electing some really terrible anti-choice politicians in this state. And so while in 2022, we have a Democratic supermajority in the state Senate and in the Assembly, and we have Kathy Hochul as our mayor, who's running ad after ad after ad about her support for as our governor about abortion rights, and we have Tish James as our AG. None of those people are going to be in office forever. And frankly, even having those people in office didn't get us a constitutional amendment this year in 2022, in the year when one would argue it is the most critical. So we can't be complacent here in New York because nothing happens on its own. It requires a tremendous amount of advocacy. So with that, I will pause. I think we touched on a lot of stuff that we could go into a lot of detail on in many different directions. So why don't we stop there for Q&A?
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much, Danielle.
Yeah.
Please, big round of applause for all of our speakers today. I learned so much. So I think that we should open to questions for everyone. I know Kristen was just making dinner, but was going to come back to answer questions. And I believe that Darcy is still here as well. So if you have a question, please do the hand raising thing, which you can do under reactions. And then there's a little button that says raise hand. But I am going to ask a question first while everyone is gathering their questions. And my question is, how do all of the things that you've been talking about affect the abortion funds that have been helping people?
Great question. So for folks, what a good tee up. Thanks, Sophie. For folks who may or may not be familiar, there are usually volunteer, sometimes they have paid staff, abortion funds across the country that help people pay for abortion care or pay for the practical support they need to access that abortion care, travel, child, etc. Here in New York, there are a couple of those funds. The New York Abortion Access Fund, the National Abortion Federation has a fund that operates across the country. Planned Parenthood has their own funds. The Bridget Alliance does practical support. Some of the bills that I talked about would have given them money, which probably would have been helpful. Abortion access, the taxpayer write-off checkoff fund would have done that. Reproductive Justice and Equity Fund, Freedom and Equity Fund. I get it wrong every time.
Freedom. You're right. Yeah.
Would have provided funding to both of those kinds of organizations. The city of New York has been providing $250,000 a year for the last 3 years to the New York Abortion Access Fund. And there's a campaign underway to expand that to $500,000 and to give $500,000 a year to the Bridget Alliance. Every time something happens in abortion rights world, funds get a whole bunch of donations, which is important. They are mutual aid before we sort of really talked about mutual aid, right? They fundraise dollars, they pay for things people need. End of sentence. That's the whole job. So when somebody, when SB 8 passes and there's a million people freaking out and what do we give money to? Oh my God, what do we do? People give money to abortion funds and that's amazing. However, then that thing ends or people forget about it. And so if folks are interested in supporting abortion funds, I really encourage becoming a sustaining member, doing $20 a month, having it be a repeat donation, because the fluctuation in funding is really, really hard to sustain. The way most of them work is on the first, they will say, okay, we have this much money that we can spend this month, and they spend it until it's gone. And sometimes that's like the third. And then they can't help people for the rest of the month. So having long-term sustaining funds is really important. We've worked in several cities to get municipal funding for abortion funds. New York City was the first. Austin, Texas followed. They only do practical support because they're preempted by the state of Texas. Portland, Oregon, Chicago, Kalamazoo, Michigan, all have funds. The state of Oregon actually has a statewide fund, and California is likely to do statewide funding this year as well. But it is one of the things that municipalities can do. The only other note I will say is that getting government money is a lot of work. And it's a lot of administrative work, and it can be a really big administrative burden on these organizations. So I also always encourage folks to have that conversation with the funds, if that's something that they're interested in doing with their locality.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Danielle. And then Darshana, the fines and criminality that you were talking about, would that affect abortion funds as well?
That's a good question. Again, abortion funds decide who gets their money. I think that comes to the question of, we've passed these laws, other states that are, again, seeking to make sure abortion access remains legal, are also trying to pass similar laws to protect its providers and its residents and everything. We don't know successful, right? And it doesn't preclude somebody from filing a lawsuit and being, then you're subject to legal debt and fees and all these other things. So, there's a question for creating a pro bono fund, or, seeing what happens to the folks who are on the ground in these states where there are criminal charges, the legal aids and everyone else who actually will be defending these people and need the support and need good legal representation. So that's a whole other, I think, going to be a whole separate bucket. But yeah, that will also require funding and legal resources down the line. We don't know what that's going to look like.
Thank you. The first question I see is Amy Harwood. Amy, take it away.
Yes, hi, my name's Amy Harwood. And I just keep thinking how happy I am that my mother is not alive to see this, because she was the anti-Phyllis Schlafly of our neighborhood, and she's probably spinning in her grave at a very high speed right now. But my question is for you about the 26 states that have trigger laws that will go into effect, within minutes of the Supreme Court decision finally coming down. What can we do here in New York to help people seeing abortion justice in those states? Are we legally able to go there and help drive people or provide on the ground, support, or are we putting them at greater risk for being arrested, having these whistleblowers, where they're basically getting a bounty on their head? People's economies are so bad that they find out they're going to get $500 for turning in their neighbor. They're going to turn in their neighbor. What can we do? I am very worried about New York for all the reasons you've talked about. There's just not enough providers. We need to make sure that everybody has access. I'm terrified about these poor birthing people and people who can get pregnant in these 26 states and what's going to happen, and what can I do sitting here in Westchester County?
Well,
Go ahead.
That is, I think, a question that we're often asked. I think at this point, what Danielle mentioned about funds is important in funding abortion care. You can provide housing, driving, That is one of the things. There is a potential, I think, it's just a reality that we need to communicate of, like, you might get sued for that in Texas if you drive to Texas and drive somebody back to New York. And that is why the state passed the fire hate law, which is you can counter sue in that case, which is helpful. And maybe Darcina can also answer too, as well. It's like a little bit of the Wild West right now. Like, until some of those laws are tested, we don't know. We don't know how a New York State court is going to respond to a claim from Texas, and we don't know if somebody from Texas is going to have success at bringing that lawsuit across the board. Those are Clorox wipes, not wipes. Sorry, no, go get a tissue. Sorry, I have a 7-year-old across from me who is about to blow her nose into a Clorox wipe instead of a tissue, so I had to rectify that. The joys. So it is a little bit harder to determine, but I think if you feel comfortable and have the means to do so and hire a lawyer should there be a lawsuit, then we encourage that.
Do you know, is there going to be an organization that tracks people who want to volunteer for that? Immediately, the running joke was, if you like camping, I like camping, I'll be happy to go camping with you in New York State. Is there an organization that's going to be mobilizing people who have the interest in doing these sorts of things?
The best thing to do is to reach out to your local abortion fund and say, I can't donate, but I'd like to volunteer in other ways, rather that be answering phones or that. I think the rush to create a new thing is exciting and enticing, but there are networks available that are already trying to do that work. And so I think reaching out to the abortion funds is the best way to try to coordinate that work, because that is what they're trying to do, right? They are trying to get housing and transportation, and they can help set up those networks.
I was like,
that's a great question.
There's no need to reinvent the wheel. I just need to make sure that I'm volunteering at the right place.
Definitely.
There's also an organization called the Haven Coalition. That is a volunteer network based in New York City, worth looking into as well. I think it's Haven Coalition.
Thank you. Thank you very much, all of you, for speaking tonight. It was really interesting, scary, sad, and important.
Thank you, Amy. Our next question, Tasha.
Hi, thank you for this presentation, everyone. It's good to see you and good to be partners in this movement with you. So there's a lot of activity in Westchester. I'm also from Westchester. And I think I had heard Danielle say that you were going to talk about what we could do with what local government can do. I might have missed it, so I wanted to know if that was said, and hopefully we can get a copy of the presentation. But if not, if you could tell us what that was. And I have another question, sorry. I also want to know of any partnership with communities that serve BIPOC women, because this is such great information, but there's so many communities that just are not plugged in to this kind of information.
So that's both great questions, Tasha. I put a link in the chat, which is the National Institute's Local Reproductive Freedom Index. That's a place where we rank 50 cities on how well they support reproductive freedom. In New York, that is only New York City and Buffalo. However, that report also has a self-scoring worksheet, and can absolutely be used for counties as well as cities. There's a lot that municipal governments can be doing right now. They can be, again, funding abortion care. They can be ensuring that their county health services are providing abortion care within the public services. They can be repealing any laws that they may have on the books that are impeding abortion access. Westchester, I know, is currently looking at a clinic access bill that I think is getting heard like this week. Kate.
Yeah, public comments will be meeting on Monday, June 13th, starting at 7 p.m. They're looking for people to sign up to give their 3 minutes of commentary, but that link isn't live yet. So
Thank you so much, Kate.
hot off the press today. Couldn't resist.
I was like, it's happening soon. There we go. It's happening Monday. For folks in Westchester. And then the other piece is, especially at the most local level, is not necessarily abortion focused, but making sure that your school boards aren't doing anything screwed up. Aren't banning books about gay people, are looking at implementing comprehensive sex ed. The more local you get, the more things become attached to education systems. And that is a place where it is a very low bar for entry, right? To your second question, Tasha, about folks who are specifically doing work with communities of color and getting this information out there. There are amazing reproductive justice organizations across the country that are doing that, that have given us the definition of reproductive justice, the framework that we work within. There are certainly groups that are based here in New York. I think the Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice, it's not called that anymore. I think it's just called the Latina Institute, is one of the best examples. In New York City, Black Women's Blueprint does amazing work with both birth workers and birthing people, as well as reproductive justice organizing. There are several of the abortion funds across the country that are focused specifically on helping people of color, sometimes all people of color, sometimes more specifically. One of the funds that I'm a sustaining member of is called Indigenous Women Rising. They specifically help Indigenous women across the country. So there's a lot of organizations and places to do that. Historically, the reproductive rights movement has been really very white and exclusionary. And I think there is a real concerted effort to try to shift that. And certainly amongst our organizations, the acknowledgement that that's not like a nice thing to do. That is an absolute priority and requirement, because people of color are going to be far more impacted, far more immediately. Already are.
Thank you. Kate.
Yeah, thanks. I was curious about who to work with trying to get more medical providers trained, given that, if there's more people coming, we need more doctors or nurse practitioners or midwives trained. So I don't know who's working on that right now. If somebody could let me know.
I mean, this is the work I mentioned. Again, I'm trying to understand it myself. I spend a lot of time talking to doctors, asking about their, as a lawyer, I have, CLE requirements or my continuing legal education. They also have their continuing medical education. This is a really great opportunity for them to think more critically about race and gender and access and, everything. And New York State doesn't have, a lot of states have a set requirement. We have a set requirement for lawyers in New York State. There is no such thing for medical doctors in New York State. So it's a little bit piecemeal. It's based on the institutions you work with. So it is something that could call out for sort of ground level action. If you have connections to those physicians, those people who sit on medical boards, who run, hospital systems, or, are the chairs of their departments, to start educating them and getting them interested in advocating for this work. That's what it takes, and that takes outreach. That takes, again, that's like a decades-long plan. But that's where we need to be, because that's where it has to start, is with medical schools and with training, and getting people into this work. Because, for all of those of us who know providers, it's really a calling. And it's something, that's hard to lure people to, again, considering how low these reimbursement rates are for this kind of work. No one is getting rich doing this work. Even when it's legal, access is very low. Even, if you remove all those barriers to access, you're not going to have a flood of people offering these services. And so I think the first step is just educating healthcare providers on larger societal issues, and then hopefully it'll flow from there. But a big part is funding and access. The bills that we mentioned would have worked on improving facilities, offering more training, and providing the funds for that kind of work, which gets people in the door for getting that kind of job training. But yeah, it's a complicated, I think, process, but it's one that can happen and is slowly happening. As you see, healthcare plans, hospitals, medical boards all have health equity groups, and you can reach out to them, and you can, offer to send a speaker, or, offer to assist them with anything they're working on, or ask them to pass a resolution. There's steps that can be taken. They're incremental, but I think they're very worthwhile.
Thank you. Our next question is Jean.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the program tonight. I have to be really quick because my name's Jean Lapper. I'm running for State Senate 45, and I just decided to get into the race, and I have a meeting that I'm hosting at 8 o'clock to get the count on my petition signatures. So I intend to file by Friday, and I really appreciated getting a lot of the messaging in particular is really helpful. I live in the town of Queensbury, so I know we have we have a great Planned Parenthood center here. But this district goes all the way up to Canada, and it is really poor. I did a tour last week of some parts, and it's really sad and really poor. And I'm in a McDonald's at 11 o'clock, and there's young women with 5 little kids, and it just is. I don't know what the access is like, so I'm be curious to see what's available throughout. I mean, the district is 6,800 square miles, and our current congressional representative is Elise Stefanik, and the state senator is a supporter. He's a loyalist to her. So you see what I'm up against, but I do think I have a chance. And so I'm looking forward to getting more information from everybody. And I'm hoping that those messaging slides are available.
Sure, I can absolutely share those out. Best of luck in your petitioning.
Okay.
I can let Kristen talk about their facilities in the North Country, or however
I know nobody's
they go.
We're 50 miles of Albany is the southern part, and that's where I am, and then it goes another up to Canada. Yeah.
But I'll note that rural access is a problem in New York.
Absolutely.
Right? And especially when you get up to the North Country, not only is rural access in general a problem, but also there's lots of folks who have their insurance via the military bases and therefore are uninsured for abortion, which is another sort of local challenge for that district.
So, I got to run because I have to host my meeting. So I'm sorry I'm not.
Good luck.
But thank you.
Thanks for running. And we'll connect.
Yeah.
On the Planned Parenthood access up there.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you for stepping up to run. Our, I believe, last question of the evening is Jill.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jill Fieldstein. I'm running for the 105th Assembly District. That's Southern Dutchess. And Danielle, this is a question for you. I wanted to know, the 105th District is decidedly red, I would say. Almost all red. So I wanted to know about the messaging. You said it was tested. Has it ever been tested in a more red district, or?
Yeah, it's been tested in districts in Pennsylvania, Arizona, and New York, all kinds of districts. Here's the thing, that's not persuasion messaging. there isn't a ton of persuasive middle left. However, unfortunately, if you're running as an abortion rights candidate, as a candidate who supports abortion access, we want to make sure that you are A, not running away from that, and B, talking about it in the most effective possible way. So I think it is messaging that you can be using in your district, but I would just note that is not persuasion messaging. That is messaging that when you're talking to someone who already agrees with you, but needs to understand why it's important.
Right. All right. And so then my corollary is there any sense in engaging with someone who basically says abortion is murder? And if not, if there is, what's a good thing to say? And if it's not, how do you gracefully extricate yourself from that conversation?
Kristen definitely has thoughts. I can see it in her face, but also, and I'll let her turn to that, but of course she does. But, I'll note, I think if you're running for office, there's an obligation to interact with everybody, to a certain extent. Right. There is not an obligation to interact with people who are being abusive or threatening or violent. And sometimes that's a thing that happens. However, I think if you're interacting with constituents, there's a place where you can just say, listen, we disagree about this. My values are that people deserve to make these decisions for themselves and that lawmakers should not be making them for them. People will disagree. Kristen, do you want to add anything?
Sure, because I always have something to add about talking about abortion in hostile districts. I think one of the places that I often I tend to ask a question and encourage candidates to ask a question and say, where do your values around this issue come from? And oftentimes it's a faith-based argument. And so I think it's like a gauge, right? If somebody is angry and hostile, that is not someplace to engage. But if someone, it's the third question they ask you, I think it is worthwhile. I don't know what your faith is, but I was at one point pursuing ministry as a career and still am active in my church. So I often talk about abortion from my faith values and not in a way, again, Danielle's right, there's not a lot of mushy middle left, not in a way to be persuasive, but in a way to say, we just have different approaches to our faith and to what that is. And so this doesn't have to be an issue where you have to only vote that one way. And so that is the technique that I often use. If there's other issues, if the conversation has gone really well, when someone comes to my door, it's the first question I'm asking them. And so whatever their answer is that's where the conversation either continues or ends. So it's not helpful if that's the first question. But if it's later on in the conversation and you've had agreement in other places, I do think it is helpful to lean into that place if that is a place that you come from, or if someone's a faithful person saying I just think that it can be helpful for people who are seeking that type of care and try to move back to the conversation that is about the values that you already have established sharing. So hopefully that's helpful.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions tonight? I've never ended a training on time. I'm so proud of us. Good job, team. All right. So I'm gonna do this. Like I said, this will be faster. Boom. Okay. Thank you everyone so much for joining us. Thank you to our incredible speakers. I learned so much and I hope you all did too. I'm going to close by saying, remember that this is the first step of the fight for abortion access, not the last. So make sure that you are doing an action item, donating to an abortion fund, calling in elected, running for office, and making sure that your voice is heard on this issue. Thank you for joining us. I will say before we go, and I know 18,000 people have already told you this, but I'll tell you again that we have 2 primaries coming up, not 1, but 2. On June 28th, we have the assembly and statewide primaries. You will need to be voting in that. And then on August 23rd, we have the congressional and state Senate primaries, and you will be needing to vote in that as well. So please make sure that you are registered to vote at your address, that you have a voting plan, whether that's in person, by mail, early, or on election day. Make sure you know. And remember that if there is a candidate that you feel passionate about, knock doors for them, make phone calls for them. And if you don't know who yet, we will be releasing our assembly endorsements this week. We will be releasing our Senate endorsements going forward. So you can always look out to us for which candidates you can be activating for. So remember, vote, knock doors, do all of those things that are going to elect the pro-choice women that are going to make New York the abortion sanctuary that it must be. Thank you all again. Please enjoy your evening. Thank you to our speakers. Good night.